In the last episode, Tokugawa Ieyasu's Eastern Army came face to face with Ishida Mitsunari's Western Army at the Koei Tecmo, where a brief skirmish would take place, resulting in an early Western Army victory. Yet the positioning of Mitsunari's forces was not a favorable one and could potentially allow Ieyasu to simply bypass him. This would force Mitsunari to forego the advice of some of his senior veteran allies, and instead march to a new location where he could better intercept the Tokugawa, a location known as Sekigahara. At around 7 p.m. on the 20th of October, just hours after the battle at the Koei Tecmo, Ishida Mitsunari, leader of the Western Army, would call for a general withdrawal. Leaving only 7,500 men behind to garrison Ogaki Castle, his forces fell back west towards the location where Kobayakawa Hideaki had established his position. It was a small village located in a valley along the Nakasindo, an ideal spot where Tokugawa Ieyasu would be forced to meet him in battle if he was to continue west any further towards the capital, Osaka, and importantly, Mitsunari's castle at Sawayama. Setting up his army here would give Mitsunari a great advantage, as the natural defensive terrain of Sekigahara would be a tough obstacle for the Eastern Army to overcome. The march through the night was a miserable one, as dense rain began to fall, pouring in horizontal sheets onto the soldiers. It is said that visibility was near non-existent, and perhaps on more than one occasion nearly led to groups of soldiers perceiving one another as enemies, almost starting an unfortunate battle of friendly fire in the darkness. Luckily, things never escalated to that point, and by early in the morning, the divisions of the Western Army had reached their positions. The formation of the Western Army would rely upon the valley's natural terrain to completely block off any attempt for the Eastern Army to sneak through. At the base of Mount Sasao would be Mitsunari himself, joined by Shimazu forces under Shimazu Yoshihiro, while Shima Sakon would set up in front of Mitsunari's contingent, along with Toyotomi retainers at his flank. In the middle were the bulks of soldiers under the command of Konishi Yukinaga, Ukita Hideye, and Otani Yoshitsugu, who would close off the way to the west. And upon Mount Matsuo and along its base was Kobayakawa Hideaki and other Western Army allies. But this was only part of the setup. Further east around the bend of Mount Nangu, additional forces would be established, where they would then pressure the Tokugawa from behind. Here we find significant forces such as the Mori and Chosokabe. This was a brilliant setup and a foolproof way to win the battle, if everyone did what they were supposed to do. As when the Tokugawa army made their way in, their initial engagement with the main line would then be met with Hideaki's attack from Mount Matsuo from the flank, while further down, the Mori and Chosokabe would push up to hit the Eastern Army from the rear. Surrounded, Ieyasu's panicked army would collapse and he would ultimately be crushed. Obviously though, as good as this formation was, there were still major concerns within the Western Army camp. Rumors were starting to turn into open secrets of those in the Western Army who may decide to turn coat during the battle to support the Tokugawa. For one, the loyalties of Kobayakawa Hideaki were always in question, as he had been particularly hard to sway, leading many to suspect that when the time came for him to actually take action against Ieyasu, he would choke under the pressure. Additionally, others were starting to spread word of a possible secret pact between the Mori and Tokugawa following Mitsunari's treatment of Mori Teramoto, a pact that the Mori would decide not to engage the Tokugawa whatsoever. But besides those two stirrings, It was also quite clear that the Shimazu were extremely upset following the earlier discussion at Ogaki, when Shimazu Yoshihiro had suggested a night raid only for his idea to be soundly shot down and perhaps even insulted. With Yoshihiro angered by this, his own motives were becoming questionable as well. Yet even with suspicion of betrayal flowing freely about, Mitsunari remained optimistic despite others within his own council repeatedly telling him the dangers set before them. But honestly, at this point, what else was Mitsunari to do? The great battle was set before them. There was no turning back anymore. We have to remember, and I've said it before, this battle was going to be incredibly close, as both armies numbered equally around 80 to 90,000 each, and thus would hinge on the decisions of key individuals. No one really knew what was going to ultimately happen, and there were plenty of samurai who were concerned they had made a mistake and were fighting on the wrong side, a side that was perhaps about to lose. There was an air of anxiety that hung throughout the field, as the growing concern over the pressure of what was about to happen over the next several hours began to really set in. And at the time, the prospect was probably not lost that this was for sure about to be the largest and most significant battle the country had ever faced so far. Shortly before midnight, Tokugawa Ieyasu had been informed of the Western Army's movements and where they were perhaps heading. It is said that he quickly understood Mitsunari's plan to block his path along the road, and thus quickly ordered his forces to mobilize and follow the Western Army onward. Through the hard rain, the Eastern Army would make their way towards Sekigahara, and it is even reported that during their march, Fukushima Masanori's unit would actually bump into that of Ukita Hideye from the Western Army, a surprise that might have started the battle right there that night, yet both sides would quickly pull away from one another in the chaos of the storm. By dawn, the rain had ceased, giving way to a dense fog that settled over the land. Through the mist, Ieyasu established his army opposite to Mitsunari's. Although he knew he would need to be the one to take the fight to the Western Army, he still deployed his forces defensively, knowing the possibility of being surrounded and closed in upon. The main bulk of his army would position themselves near the actual village of Sekigahara, with the front line consisting of forces under significant figures like Kurora Nagamasa, Hosokawa Tadaoki, and Fukushima Masanori. While behind, inside the main body of troops were figures such as Toro Takatora, Ii Naomasa, and Honda Tadakatsu. Behind them was Ieyasu's main contingent, who set himself up back along the road where he could witness things play out and lead his troops accordingly. But even further back behind them, he had left reserve forces to catch any attack that may come around from the rear of Mount Nangu. It was obvious that although he had made plenty of secret pacts with the Western Army leaders, he was not about to take any chances. Ieyasu was well aware that he held an unfavorable position in the valley. However, records indicate that he was still confident regardless. So much so that when gearing up, he actually decided to forego wearing a helmet, a move that showed that he believed there would be no need and that his forces would easily mop up the Western Army without him actually coming under any real pressure. This also worked to perhaps bolster the confidence of his own soldiers, to show that he was overly optimistic with what the outcome of the day would be. But deep down, Ieyasu was perhaps much more concerned than he let on, as there was a very real possibility that he could be defeated here, especially since he did not hold a sizable majority in terms of numbers. Meaning that he may be forced to rely upon the word of those in the Western Army who had agreed to take his side. One of the major things that could have alleviated this concern was the appearance of his son, Tokugawa Hidetada, who had set out along the Nakasindo with 38,000 troops to mask the Sanada clan's Ueda castle before continuing on to link up with the rest of the Eastern Army. The numbers that Hidetada could bring would almost definitely swing the balance of power far over onto the Tokugawa side. But as of yet, he had not arrived. However, we do know where Hidetada has been. If we look back to episode 55, Hidetada had instead decided to go glory hunting in attempts to take Ueda Castle, yet had completely failed and was now running days late to link up with his father's army. His decision was perhaps the largest thing that placed Ieyasu's chances of victory prior to the battle in jeopardy. By around 8 a.m., the fog finally began to lift, revealing the armies to each other. Surprisingly, both forces were positioned extremely close, yet they had not known this due to the fog. Of course, the Eastern Army was going to have to take the fight to the Western Army, who were now ready and waiting. To lead the vanguard, it had been predetermined that Fukushima Masanori would make the first charge. Masanori had previously served under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, leading vanguards on multiple occasions, and was a veteran of the Korean invasions. He was a respected leader, yet being that his loyalties did not initially lie directly with Ieyasu, led another lord to anger. This lord was Ii Naomasa, a seasoned Tokugawa commander who believed that if anyone should lead the first attack, it should be someone who had long served the Tokugawa, and not someone who had just recently switched over. Naomasa's unit was ordered to act as an escort to a division under the command of Tokugawa Ieyasu's fourth son, Matsudaira Tadayoshi. Yet he was not about to sit by while Masanori took the honor of drawing first blood. It is not known who gave the first order to attack, whether it was Masanori who had begun to advance or not. But quickly, Naomasa and his elite unit of red-clad warriors known as the Red Devils burst forth towards the Western Army line. They charged completely past the Fukushima division before Masanori had any idea what was going on. A samurai by the name of Kani Saizo called out to the E detachment demanding that they halt and that Masanori was to lead the attack. But Naomasa simply brushed it off and called back that his troops were moving forward to make an inspection of the enemy lines. Once Masanori caught on to what was happening, they too began running after Naomasa. It was now a foot race to see who could hit the enemy first, Ii Naomasa or Fukushima Masanori. And in the end, it would be the Red Devils who would smash into the defensive line of Ukita Hideye, while Masanori trailed in behind. The battle had begun. Following behind the initial push came the rest of the Eastern Army body as they began clashing with other Western Army forces in the center. While Ii Naomasa and Fukushima Masanori were facing down the Ukita, the forces of Toro Takatora and Kyogoku Takamoto charged in against the line of Otani Yoshitsugu. This was quickly followed up by units of Kurora Nagamasa, Hosokawa Tadaoki, and others rushing up to smash into the main contingent of Mitsunari's own troops. Across the entire line, a hard back and forth between tens of thousands of soldiers ensued, as sounds of metal clashed and screams of war rang out, all while the roar of guns drummed on. Rivers of blood must have poured forth as the mud from the previous night's rain had drenched the land. There had never been a samurai battle quite like this ever before. And it is important to remember that this was not simply a battle waged for the sake of politics. Many Eastern Army leaders who were now grinding hard against the Western Army line had one thing on their mind: taking Mitsunari's head, as many of them held past grievances towards him for either his actions under the command of Hideyoshi, or during the invasion of Korea, or even leading up to this battle itself. There were a plethora of people he had rubbed the wrong way throughout his career, and for them, this battle was personal. But as hard as the Tokugawa line pushed after the initial charge, which had at first cut deep, they were now being held firmly back, as the soldiers of the Western Army fought bravely to hold their position and wear away at the enemy momentum. To counter this, Eastern Army forces began using their guns to fire hard against Mitsunari's flank. Yet no part of the battle was as chaotic as the middle clash between Fukushima Masanori and Ukita Hideye, as a desperate back and forth led to Masanori continually pushing in deep, only to time and time again be driven off by Ukita cavalry. For 2 whole hours this intense struggle had raged across the valley, and one samurai who was present would later write of the scene, stating that ally and foe pushed against each other. The musket fire and the shouts echoed from the heavens and shook the earth. The black smoke rose, making day as night. I can't imagine anyone today being able to picture the sheer carnage that must have played out here. But while the battle continued between Mount Sasao and Mount Matsuo, across the valley around Mount Nangu, the Mori and Chosokabe armies held their position, as Tokugawa detachments stared them down. Had the Mori and Chosokabe charged in, the situation may have changed drastically, but instead, they waited. Kikawa Hiroye was to be the one to order the attack from around Mount Nangu, But if we remember back, it was also he who had orchestrated a secret truce between the Mori and the Tokugawa, following Mitsunari's dishonoring of Mori Terumoto. Thus, no order to attack came from Hiroye, and without the Mori forces attacking, the Chosokabe sat waiting as well, not wishing to charge forth without Mori support. This eventually led to Tokugawa detachments taking the initiative and assaulting the contingent of forces under Natsuka Masae. With their rear flank around Mount Nangu held in check, Ieyasu decided to move his camp further up towards the main battle, just about a half-mile from Mitsunari's position. And it is here we can actually get a glimpse at the anxiety that was starting to affect Ieyasu himself, as just before heading out to move his position up, a retainer of his decided to mount before Ieyasu, probably in the excitement of the moment. But this was a breach in protocol that sent Ieyasu into a fit of rage, drawing his sword and exploding forth to slash at the man. Luckily the retainer made it away, but this display definitely shows that Ieyasu's nerves were a little bit more than just on edge with everything going on. By 10 AM, roughly no significant progress had been made yet as the Tokugawa line continued to grind into Mitsunari's, with one of the only major developments being that Shima Sakon, whose own position had been in front of Mitsunari's, had been hit by a bullet during the thick of the fighting, causing him to pull back. Shortly after, he would die from this wound. The loss of Sakon must have been a serious blow to Mitsunari, as Sakon had not only been an integral figure for Mitsunari's own strategy, but also he had been a close friend and confidant in his council. His death would have done much to break down Mitsunari's confidence, as well as his own mental state. Yet all was not lost. By this point, Mitsunari was still banking on not only the attack from around Mount Nangu by the Mori and Chosokabe, but also the assault from Kobayakawa Hideaki, who still sat waiting for Mitsunari's orders atop Mount Matsuo. With the Tokugawa line being whittled down more and more by their relentless push into the Western Army front, an attack by Hideaki into the Tokugawa flank would be sure to break the Eastern Army. But it was not yet time for that. The situation on the field was still manageable, and Mitsunari wagered that he could wait a little while longer to continue to let the Tokugawa forces drain themselves before his all-out counterattack. The only element of his army so far that troubled him was inaction on the part of the Shimazu, who sat next to his position. As of yet, as the battle had been raging for hours, the Shimazu had not joined the fight. Eventually, this prompted Mitsunari to send a messenger to deliver word to Shimazu Yoshihiro, inviting him to join the action. However, Yoshihiro had no intention of doing so, and it did not help that the messenger himself did not dismount when relaying Mitsunari's word. Yoshihiro gave no response and sent the messenger on his way. It is quite clear that Yoshihiro was taking out his own personal revenge against Mitsunari after their discussion the night before. If we remember back to the previous episode, Yoshihiro had come to Mitsunari with the idea of a night attack against the Tokugawa position at Akasaka. This had been turned down by Mitsunari, and in one way or another, in doing so, Yoshihiro or perhaps his strategy or capabilities had been insulted. And thus now, feeling scorned, he was not about to follow Mitsunari's command. Once the messenger returned to Mitsunari and gave word of Yoshihiro's inaction, Mitsunari is said to have mounted up himself and rode over to the Shimazu position. It is here, when confronting him, the old veteran Yoshihiro is recorded to have said, "In this battle, each unit must look to its own affairs and fight its own battles with all its might. There is no time to be concerned with the affairs of others in front, behind, or on either flank." All Mitsunari could do was trust that Yoshihiro would do the right thing when the moment came. By 11 AM, the situation had turned increasingly chaotic as Fukushima Masanori's attack on the Ukita had completely burned out, resulting in Hideye pushing Masanori's unit far back beyond what was expected. But while Masanori's position was suffering, Konishi Yukinaga was steadily being pushed back in the other direction, all while Otani Yoshitsugu's line held firm with no positive or negative movement. The situation as it stood was not an unfavorable one for Mitsunari, as Hideye's push had gone very well. So well in fact that it likely no longer would have benefited from the Kobayakawa assault. However, soon enough, Hideye's momentum began to halt, and he started to be pushed back once more. The time was now for Kobayakawa Hideaki to join the fight, and for Mitsunari to begin his massive counterattack against Ieyasu. Mitsunari ordered the signal flare be lit, the indicator to Hideaki to charge down from Mount Matsuo and slam into the Tokugawa flank. After the flare was lit, all attention was drawn to the mountaintop, as Mitsunari watched desperately to see the charge of the Kobayakawa forces. The Kobayakawa were really the deciding factor on the field. If they were to charge down into the Tokugawa, their momentum would be sure to break Ieyasu's tired line. But on the other hand, doing so to the Western Army would have the same effect. Hideaki was indecisive. Even before the battle had begun, we had previously seen the constant wagering in his mind over who he should be loyal to. The Toyotomi, although they were now led by Mitsunari, who he despised despite all the promises Mitsunari had made for him, or Tokugawa Ieyasu, someone who he did trust and who had earned his confidence in the past, but now was fighting against the Toyotomi regime. Not to mention the implications for what would happen after he did make his decision. If he did attack the Tokugawa, was Mitsunari really about to give him all that he offered? Would he really be the gracious leader he had propped himself up to be? And on the flip side, if he betrayed Mitsunari, he would always have to wear that shame around his neck that he was an untrustworthy turncoat. For now, he sat motionless, giving no order, as a completely separate battle raged endlessly in his mind. Faced with inaction from Hideaki, the Western Army began to send up messengers to him with calls for aid from Otani Yoshitsugu and Konishi Yukinaga, pleading for him to attack. Yet he gave no response. Instead, he sat in a state of confusion, unsure of what to do. Yoshitsugu had always suspected that Hideaki would not be loyal in the end. Upon seeing Hideaki's inaction and having his messenger return with no word, Yoshitsugu would deploy reserve forces to form a line against Hideaki on the chance that the Kobayakawa would come down the mountain at him. Around the other side of Mount Nangu, the rear detachments had seen the flare as well, and many samurai lords began to ask Kikawa Hiroye if he was ever going to order the attack from that side to commence. Instead, Hiroye apparently shooed them away, telling people not to bother him because he was eating. Eventually, Kurora Nagamasa would even send a messenger up to Mount Matsuo himself to discern if Hideaki was really going to defect. He too would receive no answer, yet his messenger would deliver a threat to Hideaki nonetheless. Ieyasu, who is said to have been nervously chewing away at his fingernails, was also entirely focused on Mount Matsuo. Around noon, after the battle had been going on for 4 hours, and roughly only 1 hour after Mitsunari had lit the signal flare, Ieyasu would take the initiative. Believing that Hideaki needed to be forced into action one way or another, he ordered a detachment of his gunners to begin firing up at the mountain towards the Kobayakawa position. Ieyasu by this point knew that Hideaki was not going to make the decision himself. Instead, Ieyasu had to force him to make it. This was a risky move. Directly attacking the Kobayakawa could have a negative effect, prompting them to join the side of Mitsunari. But the alternative would be that it would scare Hideaki into joining the Tokugawa. Finally, with bullets now raining onto his position, Hideaki knew he could wait no longer. He quickly sprung up into action and ordered his forces to attack Otani Yoshitsugu. Hideaki had turned coat and was now about to assault the Western Army. Soon enough, Kobayakawa troops began flooding down the mountainside toward Yoshitsugu's position. He had been right to deploy a detachment to guard his flank against Hideaki, yet it was only a portion of his forces, as the rest were still fighting against the Tokugawa main advance. Hideaki's defection also caused other units at the base of Mount Matsuo to join his charge as well. Massively outnumbered and now being hit from multiple directions, the Otani line began to crumble. Yoshitsugu knew all hope was lost, yet he could not think to flee. He was a leper and was in no condition to run. Instead, he turned to his retainer, Yuasa Goro, and asked him to take his head and hide it so that it could not be claimed as a trophy. Goro followed his orders and is said to have wept as he cut his lord down. He would successfully hide Yoshitsugu's head before taking his own life. In the end, it would never be found. With the Otani lost, neither Ukita Hideye nor Konishi Yukinaga had anticipated Hideaki's treachery, and thus they were unprepared for the tide of turncoats that were now flanking their position as well. The entire Western Army line was now completely collapsing as Eastern Army troops began to break through and encircle around to the rear. All Mitsunari could do was watch in despair, while Ieyasu was probably grinning from his gamble paying off. Ukita Hideye is said to have even tried to launch a desperate attack against Kobayakawa Hideaki in attempts to take his head in revenge for his betrayal, yet his own lieutenants would hold him back. Finally, with the Eastern Army pushing in from all directions, the Shimazu were at last engaged, as Inaomasa spurred forth viciously to crush Yoshihiro. Naomasa's onslaught smashed into the Shimazu line, and before long, Yoshihiro's nephew Toyohiza would be cut down while defending the position. Yoshihiro now had two options: stay and fight to the death, or fight his way out and retreat. He chose the latter, and thus ordered a full charge southbound where he could withdraw around the back of Mount Nangu. The Shimazu forces would have no other choice than to hack their way through the enemy, and so they did, fighting heroically as they pushed through the Tokugawa lines. Still, Naomasa was bound and determined to not let Yoshihiro get away. He kept the pressure on until finally Shimazu gunners would deliver a shot to him that would take him out of the action. Without Naomasa hot on their heels, the Shimazu were able to successfully fight their way out. The Shimazu retreat would be spotted by the Chosokabe, who had still been sitting idly by Mount Nangu. Upon learning of the developments of the battlefield, they too began to scatter. The situation for the Western Army had turned into a mass rout, and with all hope having faded, Ishida Mitsunari and his personal guard fled the field. By 2 p.m., roughly 6 hours after the battle began, the Western Army had completely fallen. Tokugawa Ieyasu had won the Battle of Sekigahara, largely thanks to those who decided to betray Ishida Mitsunari. It was here, seeing the Western Army in full retreat, Ieyasu ordered a general advance, and at last finally put on his helmet and stated his famous quote, "After victory, tighten your cords." This had been the largest battle Japan had ever seen up until that point, with roughly 170,000 men fighting on the field that day. And while the actual number of casualties is still debated, with some saying as many as 30,000 dead, other sources suggest that by the end, up to 60,000 heads would be taken. Either way, it was a massive clash with a monumentous loss of life. But for Ieyasu, it was all worth it now, for victory was his. So, what can we learn? On October 21st, in the year 1600, the Battle of Sekigahara would at last commence, pitting the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu and his loyalists against the forces of Ishida Mitsunari and other loyalists defending the Toyotomi regime. With both sides having roughly equal numbers, it was going to be a hotly contested battle, where either side could have easily prevailed had all things gone according to plan. Yet, as the battle wore on, a number of samurai lords within Ishida Mitsunari's Western Army would decide to betray him, allowing Tokugawa Ieyasu to win Japan's most important battle ever. In the next episode, we see the aftermath of the Battle of Sekigahara as Ishida Mitsunari is hunted down and Ieyasu commends his allies for their service. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.